Hey guys, Level Cap here, and today I want to talk about the top gameplay design changes that I would make in Battlefield 5. Now, every game, in my opinion, can always change things to further refine and improve the overall experience. The more we play a game, the more you can find the little bumps and nooks and crannies and things that don't quite work out so well. And over the years, I've given my feedback for all the Battlefield games as to what I would like changed to improve the overall experience. For Battlefield 3, I wanted the game to be a bit more consistent with server settings, game sizes, vehicle spawns, and tickets. You never quite knew what you were getting into when joining a server, and although it brought some variety to the game, it often felt like the devs were leaving the game mode balance in players' hands, which rarely worked out. With Battlefield 4, my main gripe was with map design and still consistency issues from Battlefield 3. Apparently for this game, the devs tried a new approach, letting environmental artists do the initial map layout and then had designers come in later to make it more playable. By doing this, they lost a lot in their map flow and cover design. Some of the later maps improved upon this, but overall, I think the base game maps sacrificed game design for aesthetic design. Battlefield 1 was an incredible game visually and had some of the best class balance in any Battlefield game to date. Unfortunately, a lot of the finer game design was undone by an abundance of explosive spam, the like of which gamers had rarely seen. From the plethora of grenades to mortars, behemoths, and airplane bombing, the infantry fight often felt less about your aim and more about how well you could dodge things or just randomly explode regardless of your skill as a player. Now that we're here at Battlefield 5, saying that this game has had a rough launch would be a bit of an understatement. Now that we're on the precipice of a new roadmap and the Firestorm launch, there's a bunch of hope and a bunch of excitement in the air, and I think this is getting players re-energized for what Battlefield 5 can become. Most of the Battlefield 5 discussion to date has been related to fixing bugs, the poorly implemented assignment system, netcode, and performance. These issues, as they should have taken priority over game balance and meta. However, I think that we're at a point where enough of the game has been fixed up that we can begin to have a deeper game discussion about the overall design and nuances of combat. And I'd like to start off this discussion talking about an area of the game that I think needs the most balance and the most work, and that's vehicles. I play a ton of infantry, but I also play air and I play as armor, so I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on each style of play and what it's like to be on the receiving end of them. I think vehicle balance and the relationship with infantry combat needs some of the most work. Let's start off with tanks. Tank combat is rough from all angles. Driving tanks still feels quite buggy. Aiming is inconsistent, and dealing damage to other tanks is not well communicated through the UI. A tank movement and aiming paths should be done for refinement's sake, but when we talk about balance and meta, one of the main issues I see right now is the tank sniper syndrome. Tanks are not good in close quarters. They die very quickly. Their aim is also slow, making them bad at reacting to flanking threats. So because of these factors, the most effective way to play them is from a distance, and on most of the maps there really are some extreme sightlines where tankers can sit back and hammer away from a very long distance. This isn't really that fun for a tanker, especially a high-skilled tanker, and it's not fun for the infantry who are getting gunned down from like 300 meters away with little that they can do to fight back. The infantry-held Panzerfaust isn't enough to take out a tank at these extreme ranges, and when under threat, most tankers can just retreat if they take any damage, no problem. So many situations occur where a tanker can just sit back with little to no threat and just snipe away at targets in the distance. It's not particularly fun, but it's effective, and if you try to play aggressively, your tank almost certainly gets melted in no time due to their overall movement and mechanic clunkiness and how easy it is to disable them. In my opinion, things can and should be done to encourage more aggressive tank gameplay, making their weapons less effective against infantry at extreme range and giving them faster movement, turning, and better reactive aiming would make drivers feel more confident at close ranges and encourage them to try it more. As someone who really enjoys to try and be aggressive with armor and get in close quarters and push the objective and be effective, It's the least fun thing to do in Battlefield 5 because the tanks aren't really well set up for it. So I have confidence that if DICE gives players the tools to not only play tanks aggressively but kind of nerfs their ability at extreme ranges, that more tankers will use them as aggressive tools. Now, how about airplanes? That thing that most Battlefield players never even try or care about that much unless they're getting killed by it. I think air-to-air combat has gone from being the best it's ever been in Battlefield 1 to, well, probably the worst it's ever been in Battlefield 5. Teamwork is very weak on this front. Tail gunners have crappy engagement angles and lots of visual obstructions, making it hard to engage and track enemy airplanes on your tail. Turn speed mechanics are tame, and some planes simply can't defend themselves against others. Time to kill can be insanely long or ridiculously short depending on what rank your airplane is and what weapons you have configured, which is super frustrating for new pilots who are just at a massive disadvantage against some pilot who's fully ranked up. But what about air versus ground combat, something that most players can actually relate to? Well, unfortunately, things are bad on most fronts when it comes to this relationship. Communication between air and ground is really bad, so pilots are forced to look at tracer rounds on the ground and shoot it where they think infantry might be, or just guess and drop their bombs in an area and hope that they get lots of kills. There isn't really a lot of skill behind these mechanics, and a lot of it just comes down to guesswork. Rarely are targets spotted, and anti-air guns are well hidden and shake your screen so violently when they're shooting at you that pilots have little ability to fight against them in any sort of fun way. Good pilots will simply memorize all the anti-aircraft gun locations and hit them with well-placed bomb arches that the AA gunners can't defend against. So there isn't really a good relationship between AA cannons and aircraft, which there was at least decent relationships in the previous games. In Battlefield 1, there could be fun battles between AA gunners and pilots, but now it's just frustrating on both sides. Also, infantry have very little reason to pay attention to airplanes since most of them have little to no weapons to actually fight against them. With attrition, most classes don't have the ammo to waste on airplanes, plus you hardly do any damage when they fly past, unless you're like a medium machine gunner or something, but that's got its own caveats, which I'll get into. Assaults can take them out with a well-aimed Panzerfaust if they get too close, but this isn't really a huge deterrent against aircraft. Snipers can no longer headshot dive bomber pilots, so they really don't have any incentive to pay attention as well. And using incendiary rounds on medium machine guns is frustrating because there's a long setup time on the medium machine guns, and the viewing angle is usually blocked from aiming that high. On maps like Fiel, where infantry versus infantry combat is very intense and focused, the air combat, where they constantly carpet bomb infantry, only serves to infuriate ground players. There's very little ability to fight back against the air, so most of the air versus ground relationship is just being cannon fodder and accepting that you're gonna die randomly with no control over when and how. Ground versus air hasn't always been great in previous Battlefield games, but Battlefield 5 feels more disconnected from this aspect than any previous game. To help fix planes, I think dogfighting needs to become more dynamic, with better turning and flight controls that doesn't encourage braking as one of the only viable tactics. Also, I think airplanes need to be able to kill each other faster, whether it's a tail gunner shooting down an incoming aircraft or a fighter plane on the tail of another fighter. I think dogfights need to be far more decisive so that airplanes can finish cleaning each other up in the sky and then help assist with ground targets. Spotting and ground communication needs to get much better for pilots so that they can go on attack runs, but they also need to be vulnerable to most types of ground fire and not just dedicated anti-aircraft guns. More 50 cals with good damage and sight lines on aircraft should be put into the game. Snipers should be able to shoot pilots out again. Ideally, I would like to have aircraft just have much better visibility on ground targets, but with less effective area effect weapons so that pilots are forced to be more precise with their attacks, putting some skill back into the ground attacks and encouraging pilots to risk lower altitude attacks more frequently, creating higher chances for infantry to fight back. Okay, let's move on from vehicle combat and discuss infantry combat. So much has changed since previous titles, and I like a lot about the new Battlefield experience, but there are some outliers in this experience that I think are just too powerful for the amount of skill required. Medium machine guns are probably the biggest area here, and they're, in my opinion, just poorly designed. They aren't an attractive weapon for high skill players, since going prone and waiting for players to come around a corner just really goes against most high skill gameplay, but doing so is actually very effective. And when I adopt the campy medium machine gun playstyle, I usually clean up the scoreboard, but it's just not fun or skillful to do so. I think the easiest way to better balance medium machine guns is to encourage movement and more aggressive play with them. Obviously, more visibility passes for prone players would certainly help, but nerfing overall bipoded effectiveness would encourage players to use it less, and speeding up the ability to quickly deploy a machine gun on a window ledge or when going prone would encourage players to move around a little bit more and try setting up quickly rather than just setting up and camping for a long period of time. Improving hipfire would also encourage players to potentially go into close quarters and try and hipfire down their enemies a little bit more frequently rather than only having one gameplay style available to you. As for the rest of the game, visibility, audio clarity, time to death, soldier animations, and clunky movement could all use some big improvements. But I do think DICE is already working pretty hard on these areas of the game, as there have been considerable improvements since launch. There are 1,000 areas of Battlefield 5 that could use work, but I think the specific areas I have mentioned are some of the most troubling to me and probably affect a lot more areas of gameplay than most players realize. Sometimes we focus on the nuanced flaws of Battlefield games a lot, myself included, but if the large overarching elements aren't properly balanced, then it can radiate into all areas of the game. I hope to see some big changes with vehicles, not just because I like to play with them, but because I often like to fight against them, and I want to see both sides of that equation become more skillful and strategically interesting. What do you guys think about my suggestions here? What areas of Battlefield 5, aside from the obvious bugs, would you like to see worked on the most? As always, guys, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.